Good evening. I am absolutely thrilled to be here and to be a part of this world-class university. I have had the pleasure of interacting with many of my colleagues. Some of them are here today over the last few months, and I'm extremely grateful to Professor Tawana Coupe, who apparently is in Mexico. I think he's having a very good time there, and for the invitation here, but also my colleagues at this wonderful institute, the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute, Professor Derek de Jong, Professor Willem Fury, and also Dean and Professor Ferris. Thank you so much for your kind words. I'm really delighted to be here. So I spent the weekend in Joburg thinking a little bit about what I'm going to say today. And it took me a while, and I still haven't figured this out. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so we're going to play along. But I wanted to say that, you know, we often have these visiting positions and appointments. I feel that we're actually hitting the ground running. And so I just wanted to share a bit of news with you before I start the talk. On Friday, I submitted a proposal together with the University of Pretoria with this is to the Guild Arua Alliance for a 10-year, very ambitious project that looks at the politics of sustainable development. So we're going to have two hubs, Pretoria and Oslo, and work closely with UC Louvain in Belgium and with Utrecht University in the Netherlands, and then with many of our colleagues on the African continent, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Malawi. So this is going to be pretty interesting. We're going to have research schools, basic research, publications, but not least high-level political dialogue on climate action, on sustainable development based in Pretoria. So I'm really excited. We submitted this on Friday, and fingers crossed, we've already got seed funding, which is really good. You know, we don't have to wait for funding. We can start these activities, and I'm really excited. So I just wanted to share that bit of news, that it's not all talk, it's actually some action. So coming back to the talk, I thought I'd structure this in a two-part way. I was thinking, you know, should I have a very heavy theoretical talk? And I decided against it. This evening, you need to be entertained. And so I thought I would share a little bit about some of my interactions with colleagues over the years, but also how I understand development. So the first part, I thought it would be about development, poverty reduction, what is new and what isn't new. And then in the second part, talk a little bit about the politics of poverty in a changing global order and highlight some of the studies I've been doing in China, in India, in Malawi, in Rwanda, and hopefully also now increasingly in South Africa going forward. So let me start then first with how I understand development, this animal called development. I'm sure if I asked you, what is development? What is poverty reduction? Each of you would have very different understandings. You know, just the concept of need. What is need? What is it that we need today? My needs are very different from yours, depending on where I live, what phase of life I'm in, what is my prior background. You know, so development is notoriously difficult to define, and it's also hugely contested. It is something that we don't always agree on. And we see this increasingly in this increased polarized environment, the global north, the so-called global north and global south. Never the twain shall meet. We have disagreements on very basic issues. Just getting an agreement on something which we think is very natural to agree on is hugely complex. So the way in which I understand development is very inspired by one of my mentors, Professor Atul Kohli at Princeton. He taught me many years ago. And Atul defined development in the following way. It is a deliberative movement of societies towards more livable life conditions. Okay? A deliberate, purposeful movement of societies, not a bullock cart model, not an unfocused one. It's a conscious attempt to create good change. And the three core elements to this, and I've been discussing this with Atul of late, you know, this 20 years later, has he changed his mind? He hasn't, and neither have I. So three critical elements are, well, economic growth, and you can debate this. In my part of the world, there's a lot of talk about degrowth, but we could still say economic growth is important for development. Some distribution of that growth is important. And then a political system By the way, I'm a professor of political science, so you'll hear me talk a lot about politics. A political system that somehow facilitates both growth and distribution, which is democracy. Now, you may or may not agree on any of these, but development as we see it is maximizing these three elements, even though there may be trade-offs in the process. Okay, now think back 200 years ago. And how was development then? Most people in the world were poor. And the logic then, most of the agreements, I hope I'm not coming too close to the microphone, most of the debates, at least then the idea was that poverty was something that was natural, it was inevitable. But since then, we've seen that economic growth has led to huge amounts of poverty reduction in some parts of the world. Nearly not enough as we should have had, but there has been impressive progress. But of course, we have to preface this with the pandemic. Now, much of the progress that we had achieved in terms of numerous development indicators, and particularly poverty, they've either been reversed or they've stalled. So if you look at any of the so-called sustainable development goals, I have to say, we can't blame everything on the pandemic. It's often a very useful excuse. We were actually off track before the pandemic. There was a growing hunger problem starting in 2016, and a lot of the goals were off track. But anyway, the pandemic made things worse. And the latest figures from the World Bank show that, I think it was last year, we have now over 700 million people living in extreme poverty. And there's been an increase over at least, I think, 100 million. But this is extreme poverty. This is $2.15 a day poverty, which is a very low bar. If you increase it to $20 a day or $30 a day, you would imagine hundreds of additional millions of people who are living in poverty. So the things aren't looking very good, but it is easy to get sucked into this pessimism. So I'm actually going to do something that I usually do differently. I usually talk about all the negative stuff and then end on an optimistic note so the audience feels good about the lecture. I'm going to do the opposite today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the positive first and then hone in on some of the challenge towards the end. Now, several years ago, I was teaching a module in development studies. This was, I think, a decade ago. And after hearing me speak about everything that doesn't work, as academics, we're critical. We are concerned with all the challenges, the problems. We don't really think about solutions as much or successes. So after hearing me speak about all the things that don't work, my students gave up and they said, listen, we want to actually make a difference. We want to work for an NGO, for the World Bank, for the UN, and you just got us all depressed. Tell us something that actually works. And I realized that they were absolutely right. So I devised a module and a research program called What Works? Promising Practices in International Development. This was like a Stanford, Oslo thing. And we had students from all over the world, and this really took off. This is when MOOCs were very new, 2013, 2014. So let me highlight for you very quickly some categories of successes that we have actually achieved. One would be, of course, infrastructure, technology, internet, mobile phones. Just imagine, 33 years ago when I moved to Norway, I was a poor student, and it would cost a lot of money to call my parents back home. Now, I'm not as poor, I'm a relatively well-paid professor, and I can FaceTime with my parents for free. That itself is amazing, the kind of technological advance that we've experienced. So look at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. You can say a lot of bad things about it, you can criticize it, but the very fact that there is infrastructure being built all over the world, roads and bridges and dams and schools, and soccer stadiums, you name it. So infrastructure is something that has been important, and we'll get back to why, perhaps if we have time, whether the Chinese initiative is good or bad and what the Western response is. A second set, of course, has to do with economic growth. We've already talking about this. If you think about some of the incomes, and this is data from Our World in Data, from Oxford. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. 1950 versus now, 2018, 2019. We're actually 4 times, the average person is 4 times richer in terms of income. And the world economy has grown by 13 times. And remember, this is despite despite a huge increase in population over this period. So that's phenomenal progress. What about some of the real success stories? Think about the East Asian tiger countries, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea. Taiwan is particularly impressive. 1950, the GDP per capita in Taiwan was $1,400. In 2016, it's $42,400. It is that increase that has allowed Taiwan to reduce poverty, it's almost zero poverty, invest in health and education, and just really promote well-being. So Taiwan is doing as well as most European countries in the world. Look at poverty reduction in China, which is the big success story. In 15 years, China was able to, I don't like to use this phrase, lift 500 million people out of poverty. Not 500,000, 500 million people in a span of 15 years. Now, here, a lot of people would think, oh, it's economic growth that helped China reduce poverty. But another mentor of mine, Amartya Sen, the economist, he has for long been arguing that it is investments in health and education, in human development, that the Chinese made well before the Chinese economy took off, that has really helped China be where it is today. If you look at, which is often a very interesting comparison, India and China, two very different democratic and non-democratic political setups. On every development indicator, China is better than India. And I'll get back slightly later into this one very important way in which India has done better, Indian democracy. But if you look at every development indicator, China is doing well. And it is because of those initial investments in health, in nurses, in schools, in terms of teacher training, etc. So these are things, and of course India has also reduced poverty, not by 500 million, but maybe a couple of 100 million. And these are successes that really need to be acknowledged. But even within health and education, social protection, nutrition, people actually have better food now. We don't have children dying as early as they were doing before. People are living longer. We all can expect to live at least for 70 years. That's the world life expectancy average. Because of better medicine, better food, better health care, affordable medicine. India is the pharmacy of the world, supplying most of the medicines on the African continent, but also to rich countries. Cheap generic drugs that are affordable. So all of this has created, this enormous improvement in well-being. We're actually better off. It's a bit strange to say that we are actually, we've never been as well off as we are now. Now, there are also certain countries here on the continent that have done really well. But here we have to be a little careful. When we talk about successes, we think, oh, this is something that happens all the time, over a long period. We've seen many countries doing really well for a short period. So Uganda is very interesting here. Towards the end of the 1990s, before that, mid-80s, late 1980s, there was a lot of concern about HIV. It was fast, expanding. And towards the end of the 1990s, Uganda was praised as one of these very unlikely success stories. And what really helped in terms of combating the prevalence of HIV and AIDS was strong political support. Museveni hasn't done well on many fronts, but on this, he realized very quickly that he had to really put a stop to this. There was strong political backing, money, there was support from religious leaders, faith-based organizations, wonderfully successful campaigns, your theater groups, going around, enacting plays, preaching, safe sex, use of condoms, zero grazing policy. All of this had an impact, and Uganda succeeded. Later on, it wasn't as successful, but I think we should really appreciate even success within a short period. As there are also some other successes from Malawi, Uganda, India. The CIA's National Intelligence Council in 2002 predicted that India would have, by 2010, 20 million, or was it 200 million, I don't remember, HIV cases. There's going to be a huge catastrophe, a bit similar to what the Europeans thought would be the case during the pandemic in Africa. huge catastrophe. And many countries in Africa succeeded in preventing that catastrophe. In 2022, India had only 2.5 million cases. What helped? Targeted messaging, not like in the old days where you would have these strange TV adverts saying, oh, you shouldn't have too many kids. It just didn't resonate, this old kind of messaging. Now it is about using WhatsApp, going not just all over the country, but to the high-risk areas, to red light districts, making people aware, working together with Gates Foundation or the UN is not just a government effort. And similar efforts were also very successful in terms of eradicating polio, which is again a huge success story. So I could go on and on. I'm sure it seems that you're tired of hearing about all the successes and you want to hear more about the challenges. So there are all of these things that we should appreciate. So anytime we talk about development and poverty reduction, I would really suggest that we measure what we say, because we're often talking about challenges. We don't really appreciate what we have been able to achieve. So having said that, so we have over 719 million people in the world that are still extremely poor by that very humble, modest threshold of $2.15 a day poverty. The question that we should be asking ourselves, of course, is, okay, so how do we promote economic growth? How do we actually get the distribution of that growth? And what role does the state play? These are the three elements I mentioned to you earlier in terms of the definition of development. So here you could say that, let's look at the literature. I was thinking, thank you so much for mentioning my podcast, by the way. I'm increasingly introduced as a podcaster, not a professor. I don't mind. And it's wonderful because, more people listen to my podcast than they read my books and articles. So this is a totally new medium. I'm addicted, and I'll go back to the hotel for tomorrow's episode. I have to get that ready. But it's just very addictive and infectious because you get this wonderful feedback. And so I was thinking about a conversation I recently had with Paul Collier, a very well-known Oxford economist, and was it, I think 2010, I don't remember when, he wrote this best-selling book called The Bottom Billion, about 54 countries that were stuck at the bottom. And he identified, for him, development was about chutes and ladders. And for him, his argument was that every country wants to climb the ladder of development and reduce poverty. But they often end up falling down. They're climbing, that game that we have, we're going up there, we think we've almost got there, and then there's a chute. And why is that? So according to Paul, there are 4 sort of poverty traps. And I was recently talking to him, and he still thinks that those are very relevant today. So one has to do with the fact that there's conflict, so the conflict trap in some countries, civil war. Right? So conflict is not good for development. That should be a no-brainer. There's another one on natural resources. You think that having a lot of oil or minerals or natural gas or whatever is going to be good for you, but there is a lot of evidence out there that these kind of resources can also be a curse. And there are lots of countries that, and here you have Nigeria, Angola, that have had oil. And you would think that all of this money would have helped reduce poverty. It hasn't. I don't have time to get into the details, but there is that natural resource trap. The third one is the one about being landlocked. It could also be a problem. Rwanda, Malawi, right, without access to the ocean. And a final one had to do with, this is Paul's 4 traps, bad governance, landlocked with bad neighbors, by the way, and bad governance in small states. Okay, so all of these are relevant. So, and Paul and I were talking recently, and I asked him, would you change anything? He said, if I wrote the book now, I would say that I underestimated or maybe overestimated the landlocked bit, because he had not thought that air travel would become cheap and air freight would help many of these countries, Rwanda in particular, to address the landlocked problem. So you've heard of Air Rwanda, the kind of tourism. Rwanda has just used the landlocked aspect to its advantage. So that is the only thing he would change. So what about other colleagues and friends of mine? Daron Acemoglu, one of the world's most famous economists, he and James Robinson wrote a book again, almost a decade ago, called Why Nations Fail. And the short story, man-made economic and political institutions. That is the problem. Good institutions, good development. A few years ago, they wrote a follow-up called The Narrow Corridor. So how do we actually achieve liberty, freedom, well-being? And for Acemoglu and Robinson, it was the narrow corridor between too strong a state, you don't want an authoritarian state, a leviathan, or too weak a state. So something in between. And the main argument is that there's a sweet spot between having a very activistic, strong state and an activist, very strong civil society. It is like Alice in Wonderland. You're running, but you think you're still stuck in the same place. And the argument is very interesting in the sense that you have to have a strong state and strong civil society running at the same time. If one of them slacks off, then you would have problems. If you have weak civil society, can't keep up with the state, you have more authoritarianism. If you have a strong civil society, the state can't keep up, then you have a weak, fragile state, which doesn't deliver. So you have all of these explanations. Another friend of mine, Stefan Durkon from the Blavatnik School, he's written this wonderful book called Gambling on Development. And his argument is that he builds on the political science literature, which talks a lot about political settlements, that for development to take place, if we are a country, and if we are the elites of the country, we should all agree that there's one way in which that development should be done. We should actually agree on the way forward rather than fighting among ourselves. We may be corrupt, but we have this master plan that we know where we want our country to go. He calls it the development bargain. Here, of course, democracy, development, democracy or non-democracy doesn't play that much of a role, but elites agree there is a common pathway. Of course, I haven't even talked about the international dimension, trade, aid, the WTO. There's so many issues out there, geopolitics, that can also impact development and poverty reduction. Let me touch briefly on the democracy development relationship, because we inevitably talk about democracies. And actually, there's a lot of interest in that because of the rise of China. Because of the rise of China, and because of some of the successes that Paul Kagame has experienced in Rwanda, there's this kind of renewed interest. Is democracy the best way? Is democracy really good for development? Until a few years ago, you would think that the literature was actually very mixed, the results. Some would say that democracy is very good at promoting growth, but authoritarian systems, the story is that the highest growers have traditionally been non-democratic. So when you talk about the East Asian tigers, they were all very authoritarian when they were growing very fast. But the opposite is also true for authoritarian countries. They're also the slowest growers. Now, the short story is democracy is, in between. Democracy is slow but steady, following the middle path. But what is good about democracy in this? Why do we need it? Again, let me borrow a little bit from Amartya Sen. He talks about two aspects of democracy which are crucial. One is the intrinsic value, and there's an instrumental value. Intrinsic as in, I like the smell of freedom. I love something because it has value in itself. Intrinsic. But democracy has a very important instrumental value. It actually allows leaders to know what people really want, what people desire. We don't want to depend on a benevolent autocrat who thinks he or she knows what people want. Democracy, a free press, allows citizens to articulate their desires, tell leaders you got it wrong, and by the way, we may have said we want this, but we've changed our minds. And democracy also allows you to get rid of leaders, which you can't in a non-democratic system. In fact, one of my heroes, Adam Przewalski, one of the democracy gurus, he defines democracy as a system where parties lose elections. We always think about winning, but it's about losing and then relinquishing and leaving office when you lose, peacefully. Now, if you think about, again, going back to the India-China comparison, Amartya Sen became, one of the many things he said was, which as a student really interested me, was he said that no democracy in the world has ever experienced a famine. Okay? No democracy in the world has ever experienced a famine. Mass deaths from hunger. And that got me thinking a lot. And he did this comparison of India and China. Both started their development around the same time, 47 in India, 1949 in China. And as I told you earlier, China is doing much better than India on every development indicator, except one. India has never had a famine since it became a democracy, since it got rid of the British. By the way, the British created famine wherever they went. You know, Ireland, lots of trouble with the Brits. And so, what is the reason then? So Sen says, oh, well, you know, it is a free press. It is political parties, adversarial politics, the kind of criticisms all the time. The government can't relax. It's always being told you're not doing your job. That keeps the government on its toes. And that explains why India succeeded where China did not. So between 1959 and 61, under the so-called Great Leap Forward, China experienced a huge famine. All kinds of figures out there. Some people say it's almost 35 million people died because of flawed policies. Mao thought he was doing the right thing, but there was nobody to tell him that he wasn't on the right track. Somebody should have been there to keep him on track. Whoever was critical was just sent to jail. You can't have that in a democracy. So I was very intrigued as a student. And so I did field work. And what I was seeing then was in one particular part of eastern India, a place called Kalahandi, translated in English meaning the black pot. Every month there were reports, this is the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were reports of starvation deaths, that people were dying, there was not enough food. And this was something very paradoxical because the same newspapers were saying there was a fantastic amount of food being produced, record, bumper harvests, and it just didn't square. There was food production, and by the way, there's a green revolution. We are producing more food than ever. We have Lisa here, my colleague from Norwich. She's a food security expert. We have so much food, and yet we're not able to feed people. Why? And what is the role of democracy? So I was studying this, and I was looking at the impact of drought. You know, droughts are often slow killers, and it takes place far away. It's not in the city centers, far away from the politics, from the power, and people were dying. Why? This was a democracy. And by the way, opposition parties were criticizing the government, saying, there's starvation deaths, what are you doing about it? And the government was trying to deny, saying, no, they're not starving, they're dying from something else. And if they're dying, it's not because of us, it's because of the previous government. You know, the typical sort of denial. To cut a long story short, my conclusion from that study, I was largely supportive of Amartya Sen, but I found there were some differences. Democracies, for me, are very good at responding if there is an understanding of a crisis. If we all agree here that there's a crisis, then in a democracy, there is you could say there's a political trigger that is released, like a gun, and the bureaucracy, the civil service, is then put into motion, is activated, and there's a fantastic response that is mounted. But for that to happen, we all have to agree there is a crisis. The problem comes when the government and various actors in society, the stakeholders, don't agree. The opposition says it's a crisis, the government is saying it's not a crisis. I don't know if you could relate to this in relation to your power crisis. Right, so if we do agree, then fantastic in a democracy. If we disagree, and by the way, the crisis has to be very visible. Droughts are not visible. They're slow killers. It takes 6 months, 7 months to die. But if it's a cyclone, devastation, you see these pictures, right? Then you feel like you have to react. That's when the politicians keep running and visiting, thinking, oh, you have to be the savior. In one of my books, I talk about the savior hypothesis. There's this mad rush to go and say, I'm sorry, Derek. I wasn't there for you when you needed me, but I'm here now. When push comes to shove, I'm here. I'll save you. I couldn't help you when you were under the poverty line, but now you're going under the starvation line. I'll help you move up to the poverty line. And by the way, remember, I was here. That's a typical mafia thing. I was here, remember to vote for me. And this other guy, William there, he's the competitor. he has no track record of saving you. I have. And you know, the World Bank, the IMF, all of these people are constraining my activities, but I'm doing my best now. I'm really here to help you. And this is often, I think, what happens in many democracies. So democracies are very good, but they have to be visible crises, and we have to agree on a crisis. And then this mad rush to be a savior. Why? Because I want to be re-elected. I want to be re-elected, and the only way I can do that is to save you. So what does this say then? What is it that we should be looking more at? In much of the literature, there's a lot of focus on, implementation, on state capacity. I think state capacity is an interesting concept. There's a lot of work that is done. I'm sure a lot of you are interested in that. I find it really interesting because it is about the ability of a state to get things done. What kind of resources do I have? Do I have money? Do I have competent civil servants? Do I have international help? Do I have aid or trade? So it's a complex system. Do we have good plans? Or are they useless plans? I often find that in many parts of the world, including in Malawi, where I do a lot of my work, the typical refrain is policy-rich, implementation-poor. I don't think it's that simple. It should not just be about implementation, because sometimes the plans are really bad. The plans are not realistic. The plans are not catered to that local context. So sometimes you just import a plan from somewhere else and say, it'll work here. It worked in Rwanda, it'll work here. It doesn't. So I think state capacity, revisiting state capacity is important. So a good friend of mine from Stanford, my colleague Francis Fukuyama, he's known for very many things, but there's one aspect he talks about which I think would be interesting for you, and that is we should distinguish between the scope of states and their strength. So the scope is about all the domestic and international obligations it has, the different types of functions that a state has. And the strength really is about the ability to get things done, to implement. And so what could be a problem sometimes is you have an excessively strong sort of a state that has a wide scope of actions, but is very, very weak in terms of implementing stuff, particularly when political patronage, corruption, all of this actually affects. So let me illustrate this with a couple of examples from Malawi. I have sort of a silent alarm to warn me when my time is up. So if you see me looking at my watch, that's the reason. Not because I want to escape from you. So I've been doing some studies in Malawi, looking particularly at the political, or the state legitimacy issue, because one thing is capacity, but sometimes the state, the South African state, the Indian state, the Norwegian state, wants to implement something and is not able to do that. Okay, you have all these grand plans, but you can't do that. Why? So I was looking at something that fascinated me. I have a master's program that I've started in Malawi for civil servants, and it's in Zomba, if you're familiar with Malawi. I'm actually Malawi's unofficial ambassador. I love Malawi. I promote Malawi. A lot of people say, "Where's Malawi?" I send a lot of tourists and students there. But so I usually stay in a hotel in Blantyre, which is the commercial capital, and I commute 45 minutes with the driver every day to the university to teach, and on my way back. I leave at 7:15 in the morning, and it takes me 45 minutes. Now, on the way to Zomba, I am stopped. It depends on how hungry the police officers are. I'm stopped like 6 or 7 times at roadblocks. Some of these are permanent roadblocks, you're familiar with this, with the cement and the pole, etc. And then there are some that are like surprise ones, the speed traps. The constitutional provision for roadblocks in the Malawian constitution is very interesting. It is meant to prevent smuggling of illegal weapons from Mozambique, to prevent smuggling of chamba, to prevent, these drivers, often in the minibuses, they overload passengers. So all of these safety issues, that is the official reason for the roadblocks. And every day in the morning, and I've done this over several years, I noticed that I'm never stopped. I'm waved through because I think my driver looks decent. The car is not too shabby. It's not my car. I don't look too bad in a suit. Maybe it helps. I don't know. And I'm waved through. Sometimes they would stop and ask me, so what are you doing? And, oh yes, you're a professor. Professor of what? You know, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I'm there. And every time I do slow down, because you have to slow down, I notice that the people who are suffering the most from these roadblocks are the poorest of the poor. They're the ones in the minibuses. They're being harassed. They're being stopped. Their goods are being confiscated. They're being checked. And in a rather wonderfully sophisticated operation, some money is changing hands, which is referred to as Fanta money in Malawi. They're always thirsty. You want Fanta, right? If you're going to Lake Malawi, they would say, oh, I'm thirsty. Do you have any fish? So you have to decode this, the idiom. I've had lots of conversations with Nigerian colleagues who've written about corruption, you know, just the idiom. It's our turn to eat. I'm thirsty. The earth is scorched. It's very hot today. You have to understand what they're saying. And sometimes, of course, I pretend I don't understand, but that can get you into trouble. So you're having the smooth transaction of 2,000 kwacha that is being given by a minibus driver to the police. Why? Because the bus is overloaded, certain lights are missing, something or the other. And this is a well-known secret. Everybody knows about this. There have been reports about this corruption, this harassment. Roadblocks are not there for the safety. It is an outlet. It's a rent-seeking behavior. People want money. Now, I find it fascinating that the government does nothing about it. There's a lot of talk about it. They know there's corruption, but nothing is being done. Why? So I have one explanation, or two explanations. One is, why is the government even doing the roadblocks? One explanation I have for why one has these roadblocks is the Malawian state. If you think about the difference between strength and scope, has a lot of scope, says yes to everything, but is often very weak. It is a ceremonial state. So one explanation I have is the roadblocks, and I don't know if this is the same here or in DRC where there are lots of roadblocks. One explanation is that the state is saying to people, look, I'm here. I exist. You know the tax money that you give me? I'm sorry I haven't been able to deliver too much development, but I'm here for law and order, some safety. And so it is reminding people that an invisible state is there. A ceremonial state exists. So that's one explanation. The other explanation about the corruption is, I think, also very intriguing, because I speak to the police chiefs, etc. And without naming names, I'm told basically that we know it exists, but we can't control it. If I have a crackdown against this kind of Fanta money, there will be a revolt in the police force. The police are paid very poorly. This is their way of supplementing income, because I, as the state, I can't provide more salaries, so I just turn a blind eye. So anyway, so that's one way. But the consequence of all of this is that it weakens in the minds of the citizen the legitimacy of the state. It's a sham operation. It just isn't credible enough. This also means that when the state tells you to do something, you're very skeptical. Why should I do this? Another case that I've been studying is charcoal. So energy is, of course, very much in the news in this country, but has been in the news for many, many decades in Malawi. 10 to 11% of the population are connected to the grid. 12, 14, 16 hours of blackouts, very common. So what do? How do you cook? Charcoal. The Mozambican charcoal is often better. It lasts longer. It comes in blue bags. The local charcoal, people often have to just cut down trees. Deforestation is just a huge menace. They're cutting down trees, burning it, the logs, making charcoal, using plastic bags, and selling it everywhere. Now, why is this interesting? Because officially Malawi has a ban against charcoal use. 99% of the charcoal that is produced is illegal. Only a tiny portion is legally produced. Most of it is illegal. So there's an official ban. The forest guards are supposed to prevent this. The police are supposed to prevent the transport of charcoal. On Saturday is when I'm going to Malawi. As soon as I exit the airport, the first thing I will probably see is a cycle with a big bag of charcoal at the back, being openly transported in front of the checkpoints that are designed to stop them. So why is it that one has this ban? Well, the international community, aid givers, are often very influential in Malawi. They say deforestation is bad, combating climate change is important, so you can't have charcoal. The trouble is there is no alternative. So if you don't have electricity, if you don't have gas, how are you going to cook? Solar power is not there yet. It's often unstable. You rely on charcoal, and it's not just poor people. It's the professors, it's the leaders, it's the NGOs in the big SUVs picking up sacks and sacks of charcoal. Again, the state is saying it's illegal, but is looking away. And state legitimacy and credibility are compromised. One final example, again from Malawi, which actually shows you how ignorant I've been for the last 15, 16 years. I've been studying this country. So 2 years ago, I was interacting with one of my postdocs, and she's a psychologist, and she's been studying something that I've never really paid much attention to, and that is belief in the supernatural. So a recent Afrobarometer study shows that, I don't remember the exact, between 70 and 80% of the Malawian population believe in witchcraft. And this was hugely shocking when this was released a few months ago. Shocking in the sense that people thought witchcraft is something that is related to rural people. It's not the elites, it's not the rich, it's not the educated. No, we don't believe in that. But we have 80% or 75% believing in this. It got me thinking, because I've always been very skeptical of cultural explanations on corruption or whatever. And we always talk about good governance and democracy and accountability, sharing of information, delegation of power, checks and balances. And it got me thinking, and we've just finished a paper which we are very excited about. We're speculating on how belief in the supernatural affects governance, affects the fact that leaders, and I've been noticing this in many countries, not just in Malawi, the president is always secretive. The worst position for me in many countries is to be the vice president of anything. Because you're seen to be a competitor. You want to guard everything. You don't want to share. You want to be very, very closed. And you don't have, press conferences. You're not really answering things. It's all, subtle. And so what we're speculating, what we find, we did lots of interviews with traditional healers, but with also politicians, is that this is entrenched. So even though Western actors, aid agencies, international organizations are talking about good governance, etc., in reality what is happening is people are just not talking to each other. And so it's very common for my colleagues in Malawi and many other parts to never say that they're pregnant. They never say they got a promotion. They never say they got a scholarship to travel. Why? Because they fear witchcraft. And it is often envy. It is based on envy. And it is always evil. Because in reality, when you look at the literature, you could use witchcraft for good things too. But in most cases, it's this envy. I don't want somebody to be as rich. So we're speculating, and we have evidence for this, that people are afraid to share information lest somebody else becomes envious. And this affects governance. We never want to share much. We don't want to delegate. So political trust in the state is eroded. I have to say that when I was talking about democracy and development, I forgot to say that Afrobarometer reports actually show that most African citizens are extremely supportive of democracy. It's not like they don't want democracy, but they are often very dissatisfied with what democracy got them. And so it is they want more democracy. And there's a lot of discussion nowadays on the Rwandan model, right? Is this possible? It's the cleanest. I mean, if you've been to Kigali, it is so impressive, the cleanest, better than Singapore. And that's saying a lot. It's the cleanest. Everybody's, cleaning everything. The motorcycle taxis, they're all wearing helmets with yellow vests. They're producing electric cars and mobile phones. It's the donor darling. Rwanda is seen to be the country where things happen. The question is, critics say, oh, it's not a democracy. Is it sustainable? Where is the next leader going to come from when Kagame leaves? Oh, and by the way, can this model be replicated in Kenya and in Ethiopia? They say, it's very unique. So again, there are all of these questions, but grudgingly acceptance that Rwanda is able to export its coffee, get a deal with Starbucks to sell coffee in the United States, which Malawi, another similar country, landlocked, hasn't been able to. So something about leadership, transformational leadership or transactional leadership, whatever you say, maybe there's something to it. But I've also heard a lot of my colleagues say we sometimes put too much emphasis perhaps on leadership. There may be something else too. So being aware of these balances is going to be crucial. So let me end. The silent alarm went off. The global scene at the moment, I've been talking you through or giving you this tour of some of these countries that I've been studying. We have a global development agenda that I can just use one word to describe, which is fragmented. There are all of these debates, all of these discourses. We have the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are off track. We have to somehow bring them back on track. So in September, world leaders are going to meet in Washington, in New York, to bring them back on track. I'm not very optimistic. I don't think we're going to meet any of these goals. Some countries will, but many countries will fail. We have a finance problem. There's a lot of talk about global public goods. I don't know if you're familiar with this in terms of preventing the next pandemic or climate change, right? It's a global public good. It's not something we own. It's for everyone. What happens in Hong Kong or in China affects us. But there is very little willingness to finance this. Now we have, after COP27, the climate change conference last year, we have an agreement on so-called loss and damage, climate reparations. Rich countries that have become rich, like Norway, like the United States, like the UK, that have polluted the world, should pay low-income countries for that pollution to finance climate action. So one agreed on that. There's a roadmap. It's going to take 2 years to figure out a mechanism. But most people I talk to are very skeptical. They can't see these rich countries ever paying a lot of money. And it has also to be said that a lot of low-income countries don't always have a plan to use the money. It's often, give us the money, but so you have to pitch a good idea. So there's a lot of discussion on climate change, loss and damage, etc. But I also see something positive, and I don't know if you would agree, and this is my final point, noticing in terms of the African continent. It seems that everybody is interested in Africa now. There's this resurgence in interest. And if you notice the kind of summits that are held almost every year, it's Africa +1. Africa, and it's never Africa first. It's always France, Africa, UK, Africa, China, Africa, India, Africa, Russia, Africa, every country, Germany, Africa. So you have all of these summits, and everybody wants to do business with African countries. But often, it is a lot of talk. Some countries benefit, the big ones do. I think it is time now that African leaders actually leverage this huge interest, but to negotiate to get better deals, to negotiate as a bloc, so that some of the less economically advanced countries, like the Malawis, like many of the others in the region, it should not just be South Africa or Kenya or the big economies that benefit, but somehow negotiating better deals with the Chinese for Belt and Road infrastructure projects, for whatever. Unfortunately, the US and the EU are now launching their own infrastructure programs, which is good, but it doesn't give me a lot of hope when they try to market this as doing it to combat the rise of China. Not because they really want to promote infrastructure on the continent, but it is because they fear that China has a head start. I think there should be something more than that, genuine goodwill. Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, often talks about the problem in the world is the lack of goodwill. So I think we really need to move away from this feeling sometimes we have. A lot of countries have Africa strategies, etc. It's almost this kind of passive recipient of something. I think we can do better. I think African countries, citizens should be negotiating better deals to make sure that one is more of an active agent and not a passive patient. Thank you very much.